The advertisement Adelaide Wainwright nailed to the post outside the Larkspur Hollow Mercantile in the spring of 1878 would be read by 11 men, laughed at by 3 women, and torn down by her own trembling hands before the sun reached its highest point. But by then it no longer mattered, because the 12th man to pass that board had already committed every word of it to memory, and he was not a man who forgot things easily. The wind off the Wyoming plains carried grit, and the smell of horse sweat through the wide dirt street of Larkspur Hollow that morning, and Adelaide stood with the hammer trembling in her grip, staring at the square of paper she had written the night before by lamplight, rewritten twice, and finally copied out in her neatest hand, because she could not bear for anyone to think a widow could not even write proper. WANTED, the paper read in bold letters at the top, because that was how such notices always began, though the word felt like a brand searing itself into her chest each time her eyes passed over it. A husband. Widow with working ranch and water rights seeks honest, capable man for marriage of convenience, must be willing to labor, room, board, and fair wages provided until such time as arrangement is settled. Inquire at Wainwright Place, 4 miles north of town along Cottonwood Creek. No drunkards, no gamblers, serious inquiries only. She had crossed out drunkards twice before deciding it needed to stay, because the last 3 men who had wandered onto her land looking for work had reeked of whiskey before noon, and she had no patience left for men who could not stand up straight enough to mend a fence. It was the 7th of April, and Adelaide Wainwright was 26 years old, a widow of 8 months, and so tired in her bones that some mornings she woke and forgot, for the space of a single breath, that Thomas was gone. Then she would remember, and the grief would settle over her again like a wet wool blanket, heavy and familiar. Thomas Wainwright had died the previous August, thrown from his gelding during a thunderstorm while trying to bring in cattle that had scattered along the ridge above the creek. He had broken his neck against a boulder not 400 yards from the house, and Adelaide had found him herself the next morning when he had not come in for supper the night before, and she had ridden out at first light with her heart already knowing, somehow, what she would find. They had been married only 2 years. Long enough to love him fiercely, not long enough to have children, though they had spoken of it often, lying in the dark of their small bedroom, planning names for sons and daughters who would never now be born to that particular pairing. Long enough for her to learn every crease of his laughing face and the particular way he hummed while he worked, tuneless and content. Not long enough to prepare her for what came after. What came after was debt. Thomas had borrowed against the ranch 2 years running to buy breeding stock and to dig the second well, and the note was held by the Larkspur Hollow Trust and Cattle Bank, which was to say it was held, in practical terms, by Silas Merrick, who owned the bank the way a spider owns a web, sitting quietly at its center while everything of value eventually found its way into his grasp. Silas Merrick had come to call on Adelaide only 3 weeks after the funeral, dressed in a black coat too fine for a ranching town, his mustache oiled and his boots polished, and he had sat in her parlor with his hat balanced on his knee, and told her, with what he clearly believed to be great tenderness, that a woman alone could not be expected to hold onto 400 acres and water rights on Cottonwood Creek, that the note would be difficult to service without a man's income, and that he would be willing. Here, his voice had dropped to something meant to sound intimate, to overlook the debt entirely, if she would consider becoming Mrs. Merrick instead. She had told him, as politely as her fury would allow, that she had buried one husband and was not looking to replace him with a man who wanted her creek more than he wanted her company. Merrick had smiled thinly, replaced his hat, and told her the offer would not remain open forever, and that the bank's patience, unlike his own personal feelings, had limits set by its board of directors. That had been 7 months ago. In the time since, Merrick had called in small favors, tightened terms where he could, and made certain that every hired hand who came looking for work at the Wainwright Ranch found better wages waiting at the Merrick spread instead, or found some other reason to move along before they had been there a week. Adelaide suspected coin changed hands to make this so, though she could never prove it, and proving it would have done her little good regardless, since Merrick was also the closest thing Larkspur Hollow had to a magistrate outside of the circuit judge who rode through twice a year. She had tried to work the ranch herself these 8 months, with only Robbie to help her, and Robbie was 10 years old, Thomas's younger brother, orphaned alongside Thomas years before when a fever had taken both their parents in a single terrible week. Robbie was a good boy, quick and willing, but 10 years old could not swing a post maul all day, could not rope a bolting steer, could not do 100 things that needed a grown man's back and grown man's hands. So she had sat up 3 nights running with the lamp burning low, chewing the end of her pencil, before she finally wrote the advertisement that she nailed to the mercantile board that April morning, her cheeks burning with shame, even as she drove the nail home with 3 hard strikes of the hammer. A marriage of convenience. Not a proper marriage, not one built from love, but a bargain plainly stated, the way a person might advertise for a hired man, except that the compensation offered was a wedding band instead of monthly wages, or perhaps both. She had not entirely worked out the particulars even as she wrote them. She only knew that she could not lose Thomas's ranch, could not fail Robbie, could not let Sela's Merrick win by simple attrition, by outlasting her. She stepped back from the board and looked at the paper hanging there, and for one dizzy moment she thought she might be sick right there in the street. Hank Doolin, who owned the mercantile and had known Thomas Wainwright since they were boys fishing the same creek, came out onto his porch and read the notice over her shoulder, and to his credit, he did not laugh, though his eyebrows climbed his forehead considerably. "You certain about this, Adelaide?" he asked, using her given name the way he had since childhood, long before propriety would have called for Mrs. Wainwright. Man who answers a notice like this could be anybody, could be worse than no man at all. "I have thought of little else for 3 nights, Hank," she said. "I have run every number I know how to run. Without help I lose the ranch by autumn, and Merrick gets exactly what he has been circling for since Thomas died. I would rather take my chances on a stranger than hand him my husband's land." Hank had no good answer for that, because he knew Merrick's game as well as anyone in town, and he only nodded slowly and said he hoped whoever answered would prove worthy of the risk she was taking, and then he went back inside to mind his ledgers, leaving her alone on the porch with her shame nailed up for the whole town to see. By 9 o'clock, 3 women had passed the board on their way into the mercantile, and Adelaide had heard, through the thin wall while she waited inside pretending to examine a bolt of calico she had no money to buy, the particular pitch of laughter that meant she was the subject of it. Mrs. Pruitt's voice carried clearest of all, saying something about desperate women and the indignity of advertising for a husband like a woman selling a milk cow. And Adelaide had gripped the calico so hard her knuckles went white, though she said nothing and bought nothing, and left through the back door rather than face them. By 11 o'clock, humiliation had curdled fully into panic, and Adelaide walked back to the board, her jaw set, and tore the notice down with 2 hard yanks that left the corner still pinned beneath the nail, a torn triangle of paper fluttering there like a small white flag of surrender. "I would rather starve with my dignity than live rich with my shame," she muttered to herself, crumpling the paper in her fist, and she turned to walk back toward where she had left the wagon and the mule, intending to go home and think of some other way, any other way, though in her heart she already knew there was no other way, not really, and that she had perhaps just thrown away her last good chance out of pride. She did not know, as she climbed onto the wagon seat and turned the mule toward home, that a man named Gilbert Hadley had ridden into Larkspur Hollow not 40 minutes earlier, tied his horse outside the mercantile, and read her notice twice through before she had even finished her business with the calico she never bought. Gilbert Hadley was 33 years old that spring, broad through the shoulders in the way of men who had spent a decade on horseback and behind a plow, with sun-weathered skin and pale gray eyes that had seen more than their fair share of hard country. He had ridden with the Union cavalry as a young man, scouting through the last terrible years of the war, and had come home afterward to Missouri to find a wife, Sarah, and build a small farm. And for 3 years he had known something like happiness, right up until the winter fever took both Sarah and their infant daughter within the same cruel week, leaving him with a house too quiet and a grief he had never learned to set down. He had drifted west after that, taking work where he found it, breaking horses for ranchers who needed a steady hand, driving cattle when a herd needed moving, never staying long enough anywhere to let anyone close, because closeness, he had learned, only sharpened the edge of loss when loss inevitably came again. He had come to Larkspur Hollow looking for nothing more than a meal and a bed at the boarding house, before pushing on toward the Montana grasslands, where he had heard there was work to be had on the big spreads, and he had stopped at the mercantile only to buy tobacco and a length of new rope. It was while his horse drank from the trough that his eye had fallen on the torn paper still hanging by its single nail, the wind lifting its ragged edge, and something in the careful, determined handwriting had made him stop and read. He read it once quickly, the way a man reads a notice he expects to be foolishness, and then he read it again slower, and something in his chest that had been closed up tight for 6 years shifted just slightly, like a door swinging an inch on a rusted hinge. Widow with working ranch, water rights, must be willing to labor, no drunkards, no gamblers. He thought of Sarah, and of the little farm in Missouri, and of how good it had felt once to have work that mattered and a roof that was his own to keep sound. And he thought, too, with the plain honesty he had always applied to himself even when it was unwelcome, that he was tired of drifting, tired of strange bunkhouses and strange faces, tired of nights with nothing to look forward to in the morning but more of the same emptiness. He did not know the woman who had written it. He did not know if she was young or old, kind or hard, pretty or plain, and in that moment none of those things seemed to matter half so much as the plain fact that here was a woman fighting for something, stating her terms without apology, asking for an honest man and nothing more. He tore the remaining triangle of paper free from the nail, folded it carefully, and put it in his shirt pocket, and when he asked Hank Doolin, who was sweeping the porch, where the Wainwright place might be found, Hank looked at him for a long moment with an expression Gilbert could not quite read, somewhere between hope and warning, before pointing north along the road that followed Cottonwood Creek. 4 miles, Hank said. You will know it by the red barn and the good water. And Mr., whatever your business there, you treat that woman kindly. She has had a hard road. I intend to, Gilbert said, and he meant it, though he could not have said exactly what he intended beyond that, only that something had turned over inside him that he had thought long dead, and he was not about to ignore it simply because it made no practical sense. He mounted his horse, a rangy bay gelding named Ranger that had carried him 300 miles already that spring, and he rode north along the creek road while the sun climbed toward noon, not knowing that the woman he sought had, at that very hour, torn her own hope down from the mercantile board and was driving home in despair, believing that whatever chance she had offered the world had already come and gone unanswered. The Wainwright Ranch sat in a wide bend of Cottonwood Creek, where cottonwood trees grew thick along the water, and the grass in the bottomland was green even in a dry spring, a fact that had not escaped Silas Merrick's notice in the slightest. The house was modest, 2 rooms and a loft, built of hewn logs chinked with clay, and the red barn Hank had mentioned stood a little apart from it, weathered but sturdy, Thomas Wainwright having built it himself the year before he died with lumber hauled all the way from the sawmill in Cheyenne. Adelaide arrived home a little past noon, her eyes red-rimmed though she had not let herself weep properly yet, that particular grief still waiting somewhere behind her ribs for a private moment. Robbie ran out from the barn where he had been mucking stalls to greet her, his face bright with the easy hope of a child who did not yet understand the full weight of what hung over them. "Did anybody answer, Addie?" he asked, using the name he had called her since she married his brother, and she had never had the heart to correct him to something more formal. "No, Robbie," she said, and the lie came easier than she expected, because the truth, that she had torn her own chance down out of shame before it could be answered, felt too complicated to explain to a boy his age. Nobody answered. She unhitched the mule herself, refusing his help though her arms ached with the effort, and she was still in the barn when she heard the sound of a horse coming up the lane, unhurried, its rider clearly in no rush, and she stepped to the barn door with her heart suddenly hammering, thinking for one wild moment of Merrick's men, who had come around before to look over the property with an eye toward its eventual acquisition. But the man who reined in before the house was no one she recognized, a stranger on a good bay horse, dust of the road on his coat, a face weathered but not unkind, and he sat there a moment studying the place with an expression she could not immediately place before he touched the brim of his hat and spoke. "Afternoon, ma'am. I am looking for the Wainwright place. Was told this was it." "You have found it," Adelaide said, stepping fully out of the barn's shadow, wiping her hands on her apron in a gesture that was as much nervousness as practicality. "I am Adelaide Wainwright. What is your business here?" Gilbert dismounted slowly, giving her time to see that he moved carefully without threat, and he reached into his shirt pocket and drew out the folded, torn triangle of paper, holding it out so she could see it even before he spoke. "My business, ma'am, is this notice. I read it this morning outside the mercantile in town. My name is Gilbert Hadley. I have come to answer it if the position is still open." Adelaide stared at the paper in his outstretched hand, at her own careful handwriting, torn and creased now from having ridden in a stranger's pocket, and the color drained from her face and then rushed back twice as hot. "That notice is no longer posted," she said, her voice tight. "I took it down myself not 2 hours past. I should never have put it up in the first place. It was a foolish, desperate thing to do, and I have thought better of it, and I would ask you to disregard whatever you read there and be on your way, Mr. Hadley." Gilbert did not move to remount his horse, though he did not press closer either, keeping a respectful distance as he studied her, this woman with tired eyes and stubborn set to her jaw, standing in the yard of a ranch that, even from horseback, he could see wanted for a man's hands, fences sagging in places, a wagon wheel propped against the barn wall waiting for repair no one had time to make, a garden half turned and left, as though the labor of it had simply outpaced the hours in her days. "I do not think it was foolish, ma'am," he said quietly. "I think it was honest. There is not much honesty left in most of what passes between men and women these days, seems to me. You said what you needed plainly, and I do not fault a person for that, desperate or otherwise. I have done some drifting these last years, taken work where I found it, and I will tell you true, I have not found much that felt worth staying for. That notice felt different. I do not know why exactly, except that it sounded like a woman who knew her own mind and was not afraid to say so." Adelaide's throat tightened, and she looked away from him, toward the creek glittering beyond the cottonwoods, because it was easier than looking at the plain sincerity in his face. "You do not know anything about me," she said. "You do not know if I am cruel or foolish, or if this ranch is worth saving at all. You have ridden 4 miles on the strength of a torn piece of paper." "That is true," Gilbert admitted. "But I know that whoever wrote it was not looking for charity and was not looking to be rescued, only to make a fair bargain with someone willing to work. I have spent 6 years without much reason to stay anywhere longer than a season. I would like the chance to see if this might be different. If it is not, I will move along and no harm done, and you will owe me nothing but the courtesy of an honest answer." Robbie had crept out from the barn during this exchange, drawn by curiosity, and he stood now half hidden behind a fence post, watching the stranger with the frank, assessing stare of a boy who had learned to be wary of strangers on account of Merrick's men. "Who is he, Addie?" Robbie asked, not quite whispering. "He is a man who answered an advertisement I posted and then took down," Adelaide said, and she found to her own surprise that some of the sharpness had gone out of her voice. "Robbie, go and see to the mule properly, please. I left the harness on." Robbie went, reluctantly, glancing back twice, and Adelaide turned her attention fully back to Gilbert Hadley, studying him the way she might study a horse offered for sale, looking for the tell of a bad temper or a lazy hand, though she was honest enough with herself to admit she had no great skill at reading men, having married the only one she had ever truly known. "I will not marry a stranger, Mr. Hadley," she said finally. "Whatever I wrote in a moment of desperation, I have had 2 hours since to consider what a foolish and dangerous thing that would be. But I will say this. I do need help on this ranch badly, and I cannot pay a hired hand proper wages, not with the note the bank holds against this place. If you are willing to work for room, board, and a fair wage once the herd sells in the fall, I would consider that an honest bargain, separate and apart from anything else the notice implied. You would sleep in the bunk room off the barn, not in my house, and nothing more would be expected of either of us beyond a day's honest labor for a day's honest keep." It was, Gilbert understood, both a retreat and an opening, and he was wise enough not to push for more than she offered. "That is a fair bargain, ma'am, and I will take it gladly," he said. "You will find no complaint from me about the terms." And so it was decided, there in the dusty yard beneath a sky scrubbed clean by the morning wind, that Gilbert Hadley would stay, not as a husband, not yet anything so grand as that, but as a hired hand on the Wainwright ranch, and neither of them spoke aloud the thought that had already begun, quietly and without permission, to take root in both their chests. The first weeks passed in the particular rhythm of hard work that leaves little time for anything but sleep at the end of each day. Gilbert rose before dawn and had the horses fed, and the milking done before Adelaide came out to start breakfast. And by the second week, he had repaired the sagging fence along the north pasture, rehung the barn door that had come loose from its top hinge the previous winter, and begun the slow, patient work of gentling a young mare that Thomas had bought green and never had time to break before his death. Robbie attached himself to Gilbert almost immediately, trailing him through his chores with the fierce devotion boys often show toward the first steady man they have known since losing their own kin. And Gilbert, who had lost a chance at fatherhood in that terrible Missouri winter, found himself answering the boy's endless questions with more patience than he had shown anyone in years, teaching him to whittle a proper slingshot fork, to read the weather in the shape of clouds building over the western ridges, to sit a horse with his heels down and his back straight. Adelaide watched this unfold from the kitchen window some evenings, Robbie's laughter carrying across the yard as Gilbert showed him some trick with a rope, and she felt something complicated stir in her chest, gratitude tangled up with a grief she had not expected, because Thomas should have been the one teaching Robbie these things, and the unfairness of his absence struck her afresh every time she saw another man filling that space. She said as much to Gilbert one evening in May, when they sat on the porch after supper while Robbie slept and the crickets sang in the tall grass along the creek. "It is not that I am ungrateful," she said, twisting her apron in her lap. "It is only strange, watching you with him. Thomas would have taught him those same things. I keep expecting to feel angry about it, and instead I mostly feel sad." "Grief does not follow sensible rules," Gilbert said. "I know that better than most. My wife Sarah, she has been gone 6 years now, and some days I still reach for her in my sleep before I remember. It does not mean you are wrong to feel glad the boy has someone. It only means you are still carrying what you carried before, and that does not go away just because something new comes to sit beside it." It was the first time he had spoken of Sarah, and Adelaide turned to look at him properly in the fading light. "You had a wife." "Sarah," he said again, softer this time, as though the name itself required careful handling. And a daughter, an infant, not yet 6 months old when the fever took them both inside the same week. Missouri, this was back in '72. I built us a farm with my own 2 hands after the war, thought I had found my life's whole shape, and then it was gone, both of them, faster than I could hardly understand it happening. "I am sorry," Adelaide said, and she meant it with her whole heart, understanding in a way few could the particular shape of that kind of loss. "Is that why you have drifted so long, looking for something or running from something?" Gilbert considered this a long moment, watching the last light go gold and then gray over the ridge. "Both, I think. I told myself I was looking for work, for a place that suited me. But the truth is I was afraid to let myself want anything too much, because wanting things is what makes losing them so unbearable. Easier to drift, easier to keep everything at arm's length. Your notice was the first thing in 6 years that made me want to stop and stay put, and I have turned that over in my mind more nights than I will admit." Adelaide said nothing to that, but her hand, resting on the porch rail between them, did not move away when his fingers came to rest lightly beside it, and something in the quiet of that evening settled between them like a promise neither was yet ready to speak aloud. The town, predictably, had opinions. Mrs. Pruitt, who ran the boarding house and considered herself the moral compass of Larkspur Hollow, whether anyone had asked for her guidance or not, made certain within a week that everyone knew Adelaide Wainwright had a strange man living on her property, unmarried, sleeping in her barn or perhaps not in her barn. Who could say for certain? And wasn't it a scandal? A widow not even a year gone taking up with a drifter she had summoned through a notice posted like a want ad for farm equipment. Adelaide heard about this second-hand, from Hank Doolin, who delivered the news apologetically while weighing out her order of flour and coffee. "I do not care what Mrs. Pruitt thinks of my arrangements," Adelaide told him, though her cheeks burned as she said it. "Mr. Hadley works from sunup to sundown and sleeps in the bunk room, and I have done nothing that would shame Thomas's memory." "I know that, Adelaide," Hank said kindly. "Most folks with sense know that too. It is only that gossip travels faster than sense in a town this size, and I would not want you caught unaware if you hear whispers when you come to town." She did hear whispers more than once in the weeks that followed, and she bore them with her chin lifted and her back straight, because she had learned, in the 8 months since Thomas's death, that dignity was sometimes the only armor a woman had, and she was not about to set it down for the likes of Mrs. Pruitt. Silas Merrick, for his part, heard the gossip too, and it troubled him rather more than town chatter usually did, because a hired hand on the Wainwright ranch meant fences mended, cattle tended properly, and a much diminished chance that Adelaide Wainwright would default on her note come autumn and be forced to sell him the water rights he coveted at whatever price he chose to name. He rode out to the ranch himself on a bright morning in late May, ostensibly to discuss the terms of the note, though Adelaide suspected, correctly, that his true purpose was to lay eyes on the man who had upset his careful calculations. Gilbert was mending harness in the yard when Merrick's fine black gelding came up the lane, and he set down his awl and stood, watching the banker dismount with the wary attention of a man who had learned during the war to read danger in the way another man carried himself. "You would be the hired man," Merrick said, not bothering with introduction, looking Gilbert over the way he might look over a horse he was considering underpaying for. "Gilbert Hadley," Gilbert said, extending a hand that Merrick did not take. "Silas Merrick. I hold the note on this property, and I have a considerable interest in seeing it managed properly. I trust you understand your position here is temporary. Mrs. Wainwright's circumstances are precarious, and a hired man's wages, even deferred ones, only add to her burden. Seems to me her circumstances would be a good deal more precarious without help," Gilbert said evenly. "I do not take wages beyond room and board until the herd sells, and I intend to see the herd is fit to sell come autumn. If that troubles you, Mr. Merrick, I could not say why. unless you had some other stake in seeing her fail. Merrick's smile thinned to something considerably colder. You would be wise, Mr. Hadley, not to insert yourself too deeply into affairs that do not concern you. Drifters come and go. This land and its debts remain. I have found lately that I do not much care to drift, and I have taken this concern on as my own, whether it pleases you or not, Gilbert said, and there was nothing in his tone that could be called rude, only a plain, immovable steadiness that Merrick clearly had not expected from a man he had assumed would be some rootless nobody, easily cowed. Merrick left shortly after, having accomplished nothing beyond confirming that his path to the Wainwright Creek had just become considerably more complicated, and he rode back to town already turning over in his mind the various ways a man of his position might remove an inconvenient obstacle without appearing to have done anything improper at all. Adelaide had watched the exchange from the porch, close enough to hear most of it, and when Merrick had gone she came down into the yard, her expression unreadable. "He will not let this rest," she said. "That is not how Silas Merrick operates. He will find some other way to press the advantage." "Let him try," Gilbert said, and though his voice was calm, there was steel beneath it that Adelaide had not heard from him before, and she found, somewhat to her own surprise, that it comforted her more than it frightened her. Summer came on hard and dry that year, the grass along the ridges browning early, the creek running lower than Adelaide had ever seen it, and the work of the ranch consumed nearly every waking hour. Gilbert proved himself in 100 small ways during those months, ways that had nothing to do with the bargain they had struck and everything to do with the kind of man he simply was. Staying up 3 nights running to nurse a sick calf back from the edge of death, riding 6 miles in a rainstorm to fetch the doctor when Robbie came down with a fever that frightened them both badly before it broke, teaching Adelaide herself, at her own halting request, to shoot a rifle properly after a mountain lion took one of the yearlings from the north pasture. It was during that shooting lesson, in fact, standing close behind her to correct the angle of her elbow, his hands warm against her forearms, that Adelaide became fully and helplessly aware of how much had shifted in her heart since the day she had torn a notice down from a mercantile board in shame. "You are holding your breath," Gilbert murmured near her ear, and she was fairly certain he was no longer talking about the rifle. "I am trying to concentrate," she said, though her voice came out considerably less steady than she intended. "On the target or on something else?" She turned her head slightly and found his face closer than she expected, his gray eyes steady on hers, and for a long moment neither of them moved, the rifle forgotten between her hands, the summer air thick with the smell of dry grass and dust and something else entirely, something that had been building slowly for weeks and had finally arrived at a point demanding acknowledgement. "Gilbert," she said softly, using his given name for the first time since he had come to the ranch, and something in his expression cracked open at the sound of it. "Adelaide," he answered just as softly, and then because he was a careful man who did not wish to presume, he added, "I do not want to overstep what we agreed. You said fair labor for fair wage, nothing more, and I have tried to hold to that." "I know what I said," Adelaide replied, and she found she was smiling, a real smile, the first in longer than she could easily remember. "I said it because I was frightened, and because I did not know you yet, and because I did not think it possible that a stranger answering a desperate notice could become someone I looked forward to seeing at breakfast every morning of my life. I did not know it was possible to feel this way again after Thomas. I am not certain I am ready to admit it fully even now." "I am not asking you to admit anything you are not ready to say," Gilbert said. "I have carried my own grief a long time, and I know it does not clear all at once like a storm passing. But I will tell you plainly, Adelaide Wainwright, that I have not felt this alive in 6 years, not since before I buried Sarah and our girl, and whatever this is between us, I do not want to pretend I have not noticed it." She set the rifle down carefully against the fence post and turned to face him fully, and the kiss that followed was neither rushed nor desperate but slow and searching, the kind of kiss that carries within it all the careful weeks of restraint that came before. And when it ended, they stood there a long moment with their foreheads nearly touching, both of them breathing as though they had run some great distance. "I still will not marry a stranger," Adelaide said finally, though there was laughter in her voice now, warm and unguarded. "But I do not think you are a stranger any longer." "No," Gilbert agreed. "I do not suppose I am." The trouble Adelaide had predicted came, as such troubles do, when they were least prepared for it. It began small, the way sabotage often does. A gate left open that Gilbert was certain he had closed, allowing a dozen head of cattle to scatter into the rough country toward the ridge. A section of fence cut clean through rather than fallen from age, discovered on a morning ride in early July. Small thefts from the smokehouse that could have been blamed on a hungry animal, but for the deliberate, careless mess left behind, as though whoever had done it wanted it noticed. Gilbert said nothing to Adelaide at first about his suspicions, not wanting to frighten her without proof, but he began sleeping with his rifle within reach and rising earlier still to walk the fence lines before full light. It came to a head on a hot, still night in the middle of July, when Gilbert woke to the sound of cattle bawling in distress and rode out into the darkness to find nearly 40 head being driven hard toward the eastern boundary of the property by 3 riders he could not clearly identify in the moonless dark, their faces covered with bandanas in the manner of men who did not wish to be recognized. He gave chase, but his lone horse was no match for driving off 3 armed men without getting himself shot for his trouble, and he was forced to watch, cursing under his breath, as the stolen cattle disappeared into the rough breaks east of the ranch where the land grew broken and difficult, cut through with arroyos and stands of juniper that could hide a herd for days if a man knew the country. He rode back to wake Adelaide, his jaw tight with a fury he had not felt since the war, and found her already awake, standing on the porch in her nightdress with a shawl thrown over her shoulders, having heard the commotion herself. "Rustlers," Gilbert said, dismounting hard. 3 of them drove off the better part of 40 head toward the eastern breaks. I could not stop them alone, not without getting myself killed for no good purpose. "Merrick," Adelaide said immediately, her voice shaking with rage rather than fear. "This is his doing. I would stake my life on it. He means to weaken the herd so I cannot make good on the note come autumn." "I have no proof of that," Gilbert said, "but I share your suspicion entirely. Come morning, I intend to ride into those breaks and find where they have taken those cattle, and I intend to bring back whatever proof I can find of who is responsible." "You cannot go alone," Adelaide said. 3 armed men, and you with only your own rifle." "I do not intend to go entirely alone," Gilbert said, and there was something in his expression that suggested a plan already forming. The eastern breaks belonged, by long-standing custom if not by any paper deed a Larkspur Hollow court would recognize, to a band of Arapaho people who wintered in the more sheltered valleys to the south, and moved through the breaks each summer following the deer and the good grass for their horses. Thomas Wainwright, in the years before his death, had traded fairly with them, offering flour and coffee and iron tools in exchange for hides and dried meat, and the occasional fine horse, treating them with the plain respect he extended to any neighbor, at a time when most ranchers in the territory, Merrick chief among them, treated the Arapaho as an inconvenience to be pushed aside rather than people with as much claim to the land's bounty as any settler freshly arrived from the east. That fair dealing had bought Thomas, and by extension Adelaide, a measure of goodwill that Gilbert now hoped to draw upon. He rode at first light not toward the breaks directly, but toward the encampment he knew, from things Adelaide had told him, lay along a sheltered bend of the creek some 6 miles south, where a leader named Little Raven governed his people with a quiet authority that had earned him respect, even among the wary white settlers of the region. Little Raven received Gilbert with careful courtesy, listening through an interpreter. A young man named Standing Elk who had learned English at a mission school and moved easily between both worlds, while Gilbert explained the theft and his suspicion of Merrick's involvement. "The rancher Merrick has cheated my people before," Little Raven said through Standing Elk, his expression hard. "He has taken horses on credit and paid half what was promised, and when my brother protested, Merrick's men beat him and left him for dead in the breaks 2 winters past. He has cut fences across the old trail our people used to reach the winter grounds, though the land was never truly his to fence, only granted him by papers written by men who never asked our leave. The widow Wainwright and her husband dealt honestly with us, which is more than I can say for most who call themselves neighbors here. If Merrick's men are hiding stolen cattle in the breaks, my scouts will know of it, for Little moves through that country without our notice." Within the hour, 3 of Little Raven's young men had agreed to ride with Gilbert, their knowledge of the broken country far exceeding his own, and by mid-afternoon they had found what they sought. The stolen cattle held in a narrow box canyon behind a hastily built brush fence, guarded by a single rider who had clearly not expected to be discovered so quickly, and who fled at the first sight of 4 armed men approaching, abandoning his post, and in his haste, a saddlebag that fell from his horse as he scrambled up the canyon wall. That saddlebag, when Gilbert opened it, contained a folded letter bearing Silas Merrick's own signature, instructing the bearer to hold the cattle in the breaks until such time as arrangements could be made to sell them quietly across the territory line, along with payment already rendered for the theft, $20 in coin that Merrick had apparently not trusted the man to be honest enough to demand only upon completion. It was, Gilbert knew immediately, exactly the proof they needed, and he thanked Little Raven and his men with a warmth that went beyond mere gratitude for practical help, recognizing in their assistance the same fair-dealing Thomas had once extended, now returned in kind. "Your people have been ill-used by men like Merrick," Gilbert said to Little Raven before he rode back toward the ranch, driving the recovered cattle before him with the Arapaho rider's continued help. "I am sorry for it, and I do not imagine an apology from one drifting cowboy carries much weight against years of broken promises. But you have my thanks and my word that so long as I have any say in matters at the Wainwright Ranch, your people will find fair dealing there, same as always." "Words are easily given," Little Raven said, not unkindly, "but your actions this day have shown more than most words could. Bring the letter to your lawmen. Perhaps something will come of it, perhaps not. Either way, the friendship between your ranch and my people need not depend on the outcome." Gilbert rode back to the ranch as the sun began its long slide toward the western ridges, 40 head of cattle restored, a folded letter in his shirt pocket that would prove far more dangerous to Silas Merrick than any rustled steer, and Adelaide, who had spent the day sick with worry pacing the yard, ran to meet him before he had even fully dismounted, her arms going around his neck with a fierceness that told him everything about how frightened she had been. "You found them," she said against his shoulder. "You are unhurt. Thank God you are unhurt." "I found more than the cattle," Gilbert said, and he showed her the letter that evening by lamplight, watching her face go pale and then hard with a fury that matched his own. "This is enough to see him ruined," she breathed. "Ordering theft, signing his own name to it like a fool who never imagined being caught. Sheriff Barnett must see this." Sheriff Cole Barnett, when Gilbert and Adelaide rode into town the following morning to lay the letter before him, proved a fairer man than either had entirely dared hope, reading the document twice through with a grim expression before folding it carefully into his own pocket. "I have suspected Merrick of crooked dealing for some time," Barnett admitted, "but suspicion is not proof, and Merrick has friends enough in this territory to make prosecuting him a difficult business without something solid in hand. This letter, along with your testimony, and whatever the man who fled might say if we can find him, may finally be enough. I intend to ride out to Merrick's place this very day and see what answers he has to offer." The answers Merrick offered, when confronted, were considerably fewer than the questions demanded. He denied the letter at first, claimed it a forgery, but the hand was unmistakably his own, well known to half the merchants in Larkspur Hollow who had seen his signature on countless notes and drafts over the years. And when the fleeing rider was found 2 days later trying to sell several head of cattle bearing the Wainwright brand across the territory line, his confession, offered readily enough once he understood the alternative was a lengthy stay in the territorial prison, sealed Merrick's fate entirely. The circuit judge, when he arrived that autumn on his regular rounds, found Silas Merrick guilty of cattle theft and fraud both, sentencing him to a term in the territorial prison at Laramie and stripping him of his position at the bank, which the board of directors, eager to distance themselves from scandal, filled with a considerably more honest man from Cheyenne who, among his first acts, forgave a portion of the interest accrued on the Wainwright note in recognition of the hardship Merrick's own schemes had caused. It was, Adelaide reflected afterward, a resolution more complete than she had ever dared hope for during those long months of fear, and she found herself, in the weeks that followed Merrick's arrest, finally able to breathe freely for the first time since Thomas's death, the weight of the debt and the threat both lifted at once, replaced by something she had nearly forgotten was possible: simple, uncomplicated hope for the future. It was on an evening in late September, the cottonwoods along the creek beginning to turn gold, the herd fat and healthy after a summer of proper care, that Gilbert Hadley asked Adelaide Wainwright to marry him properly, not as a bargain struck for room and board, but as a man asking a woman he loved with his whole remaining heart to share the rest of his life. He did not plan the moment with any particular ceremony, having never been a man given to grand gestures, but the words came to him as they sat together on the porch after supper, Robbie already asleep in the loft, the crickets singing their familiar summer song along the creek. "Adelaide," he said, and something in his voice made her set down her mending and look at him fully. "I have been thinking on how to say this properly, and I find I do not have any fine words for it, only true ones. I love you. I have loved you, I think, since that first morning I read your notice on the mercantile board and felt something in me wake up that I had thought long buried. I do not want to be your hired man any longer. I want to be your husband, not because of any bargain, but because I cannot imagine my life continuing on without you and Robbie in it. I want to build something here with you properly, for whatever years God grants us." Adelaide's eyes filled, and she reached for his hand, holding it tightly in both of hers. "I tore that notice down because I was ashamed, Gilbert, ashamed of my desperation, ashamed of asking for help I did not know how to ask for honestly. And you came anyway, having read it before my shame could stop you, and you have given me back everything Merrick tried to take, and so much more besides. I love you too. I have loved you for months now, I think, though I was too frightened to say it plainly, frightened that loving again meant risking losing again, the way I lost Thomas. But I find I would rather risk that pain than live without the joy you have brought back into this house." "Then marry me," Gilbert said simply, "properly, in the church in town with the whole of Larkspur Hollow watching if they care to, and let anyone who whispered about a desperate widow's notice see instead a woman who found real love because she was brave enough to ask for help when she needed it most." "Yes," Adelaide said, laughing through her tears. "Yes, Gilbert Hadley, I will marry you." They were wed on a clear Saturday in October at the small clapboard church in Larkspur Hollow, the same church where Adelaide had married Thomas 6 years before, though she found, standing at the altar in a new dress of blue calico that Hank Doolan's wife had helped her sew, that grief and joy could indeed sit side by side in a heart large enough to hold both, that loving Gilbert did not diminish what she had shared with Thomas, but simply proved that love, once learned, could be found again. Different but no less true. Robbie stood beside Gilbert at the front of the church, having been asked, with great solemnity, to serve as his witness, and the boy's face shone with a pride and happiness that told everyone present exactly how he felt about the man who had become, in all the ways that mattered, a second brother and something very near a father to him. Mrs. Prout attended the wedding, as did nearly the entire town, and if there remained any lingering scandal about the manner in which the match had begun, it evaporated entirely in the face of the plain, evident devotion between the couple, so much so that Mrs. Prout herself was heard remarking afterward, with the particular graciousness of a woman who has decided retroactively to have been on the right side of a matter all along, that she had always thought Adelaide Wainwright a sensible woman and had never doubted things would turn out well. Little Raven and Standing Elk attended as well, at Gilbert's particular invitation, standing somewhat apart near the church door out of respect for customs not their own but clearly moved by the ceremony nonetheless. And afterward, at the small gathering held in the churchyard, Little Raven presented the couple with a finely worked blanket as a wedding gift, saying through Standing Elk that he hoped their house would always be as warm as the friendship between their two peoples had proven to be. "We will make certain of it," Gilbert promised, shaking Little Raven's hand with genuine warmth, "for as long as we have breath to keep that promise." The years that followed were not without their ordinary hardships, the kind every ranching family in that hard, beautiful country came to know. A harsh winter in 1880 that tested every reserve of hay and patience they possessed. A season of low cattle prices that pinched tighter than either would have liked. The ordinary worries of weather and water and market that never fully left a rancher's life, no matter how well things otherwise stood. But they faced these together, and Gilbert proved as steady a partner in hardship as he had been in courtship, and Adelaide found in him a match for her own quiet strength, the two of them building, year upon year, something sturdier and more lasting than either had known before. Robbie grew tall and capable under their joint care, learning ranching from Gilbert and learning from Adelaide, the particular fierce love of land and family that had carried her through her darkest year. And by the time he was 18, he had become as skilled a hand as any in the territory, eventually taking a homestead of his own just across the creek, close enough that Adelaide could still see the smoke from his chimney of a winter evening and know her husband's brother, the boy she had raised as her own, was thriving within sight of the home that had first taken him in. In the spring of 1880, a year and a half after their wedding, Adelaide gave birth to a son, whom they named Thomas Gilbert Hadley, honoring both the husband she had lost and the husband who had found her, and Gilbert wept openly holding the boy for the first time, the first child he had held since burying his infant daughter in Missouri 8 years before, and he told Adelaide afterward, his voice thick with an emotion he did not try to hide, that he had not believed himself capable of feeling such uncomplicated joy again, and that she had given him back a piece of himself he had thought lost forever. 2 years after that came a daughter, whom they named Sarah Rose, in memory of the wife Gilbert had loved and lost, a gesture that moved Adelaide as much as it moved him, understanding as she did exactly what it meant for a man to honor his first great love while building a second, equally true one. Little Sarah Rose grew up with her mother's stubborn chin and her father's steady gray eyes, and by the time she was old enough to ride, her particular delight was accompanying her father and older brothers out along the fence lines each morning, insisting she was quite capable of holding her own reins. "Thank you very much," a claim that made Gilbert laugh every single time she made it. Hearing in her fierce independence an unmistakable echo of the mother, who had once posted a desperate notice on a mercantile board, rather than surrender her land without a fight. The ranch itself prospered steadily through those years, the herd growing, the water rights along Cottonwood Creek secure now under an honest bank and an honest note. The red barn Thomas Wainwright had built expanded twice over to hold the growing operation, and travelers passing through Larkspur Hollow in later years often remarked on the fine, well-tended spread along the creek, never quite knowing the particular story of desperation and courage an unlikely love that had built it into what it had become. Adelaide kept, for the whole of her life, the torn triangle of paper that Gilbert had carried in his pocket that first day, pressed now between the pages of the family Bible, where it remained soft and yellowed with age. A small, private reminder of the morning she had believed her last hope gone, torn down and abandoned, never imagining that it had already found its way into exactly the right hands before she could take it back. She told the story to her children when they were old enough to understand it properly, sitting by the fire on winter evenings while the wind howled outside and the lamp burned steady and warm, telling them how she had posted a notice out of desperation and torn it down 2 hours later out of shame, and how their father had already read it, had already decided, in the space of those 2 hours, that he would ride 4 miles north along a creek road to answer a call for help from a woman he had never met. Because something in her plain, determined words had told him this was a life worth staying for. And did you know right away that you loved him? Sarah Rose asked once, curled against her mother's side, 8 years old and endlessly curious about matters of the heart. No, Adelaide said, smiling into the firelight where Gilbert sat mending harness by the door, glancing up now and then with the particular warmth he still reserved only for her, even after all these years. I thought at first he was only a stranger who had wandered onto my land on the strength of foolishness. It took time to see him properly, to understand what kind of man he truly was. Love like that, the lasting kind, it does not always announce itself with fireworks and grand declarations. Sometimes it comes quietly in small acts of kindness day after day, until one morning you wake up and realize the person beside you has become the whole shape of your happiness, and you cannot imagine your life having gone any other way. But you almost missed him, young Thomas put in from across the room, old enough now himself to appreciate the particular drama of near misses. You tore the notice down before he even got there. I did, Adelaide agreed. And that has taught me, all these years since, that sometimes our own fear tells us to give up on hope just before hope arrives to prove us wrong. I am grateful, every single day of my life, that your father was a man who read quickly and rode fast, and did not let a torn scrap of paper stop him from finding what he did not yet know he was looking for. Gilbert set down his mending then and crossed the room to where she sat, settling beside her with the ease of long, comfortable marriage, and he pressed a kiss to her temple that made both children giggle and pretend to be scandalized in the way children do at any evidence of their parents' continued affection. I would have ridden a good deal farther than 4 miles, he said quietly, just for her, if that is what it had taken to find you. Outside, the Wyoming wind moved steady across the plains, carrying the smell of good grass and clean water down along Cottonwood Creek, past the red barn and the sturdy house, and the fences that no longer sagged, past the graves in the small family plot beneath the cottonwoods where Thomas Wainwright rested easy, his memory honored rather than diminished by the love that had grown up in the years after him, and on toward the horizon where, somewhere beyond the ridge, little Raven's people still moved with the seasons. Bound to the Hadley family by a friendship built on fairness and gratitude that neither time nor changing fortune had ever managed to erode. It was, in the end, exactly the kind of life Adelaide had once feared was lost to her entirely, standing alone in a dusty yard 8 months widowed, staring down a future that seemed to hold nothing but debt and loneliness, and the slow, grinding loss of everything her husband had built. She had reached, in her most desperate hour, for the only tool she had left, a notice nailed to a public board, and though shame had made her tear it down almost as quickly as she had put it up, hope had already done its quiet work, carrying a good man's eye across a torn piece of paper and setting him on a road north that would change both their lives forever. She thought of this often in the years that followed, watching her children grow strong and capable in the same fields where she had once wept with worry, watching Gilbert grow gray at the temples while losing none of the steady kindness that had first drawn her to trust him. And she understood, with the particular clarity that only comes from having survived one's darkest fears. That the truest measure of courage was not the absence of desperation, but the willingness to ask for help even when pride screamed against it, and that sometimes the universe, in its own strange and generous way, answered such prayers before the asker had even finished doubting they would be heard at all. The advertisement itself was long since forgotten by the town of Larkspur Hollow, one small scrap of gossip among 1,000 others that passed through that dusty street over the years, remembered by almost no one beyond the family it had quietly, improbably built. But within the walls of the Hadley house along Cottonwood Creek, it remained a cherished piece of family lore, told and retold at firesides and family gatherings for decades to come. A story of a widow's desperate courage and a drifting man's willingness to answer it, of shame turned to hope and hope rewarded beyond any reasonable expectation, of a love that had begun as a bargain and grown, through patient devotion and shared hardship overcome together, into something as solid and lasting as the land itself. And when Adelaide Wainwright Hadley died peacefully in her own bed at the age of 71, surrounded by children and grandchildren who had grown up on that same beloved ranch, Gilbert Hadley, then 78 and still, even in his grief, the steadiest man in Larkspur Hollow, found among her private papers the same torn triangle of notice paper, pressed carefully all those years within the family Bible. And he held it in his weathered hands for a long while before folding it back exactly as he had found it, understanding that some things, once found, were meant to be kept close for the whole of a life, a small and humble testament to the way love, properly answered, could transform even the most desperate of beginnings into the truest and most enduring kind of happiness.